Hello everybody and welcome back to the Sapper Woodworking channel. So it's been a while since I made a segmented bowl, and you just never know where inspiration for projects come from. And a couple of weeks ago I was fortunate enough to purchase from a private seller about 30 exotic hardwoods. That stash included Canarywood, Padauk, red heart, purple heart, zebra wood, cocobolo, some Brazilian cherry, and a couple of other boards that I can't seem to identify. But I know I wanted to make a segmented bowl featuring a couple of those exotic species. So in this case, I just picked Padauk and canary wood for my feature rings, and I wanted to mix that in with some walnut. So I just did a simple YouTube search for segmented bowl, walnut, Padauk, and canary wood, and I was lucky enough to hit on a bowl made by a Marc Sitkin, and I'll put a link down in the description to his page. So this wasn't my design. I like Marc's design of his project, and other than not including a small little accent piece in my top ring, I just duplicated his design with a slightly different shape of the bowl itself. So thanks, Marc. Beautiful bowl you made, and I was happy to have the opportunity to duplicate it. In this video, I will occasionally add some commentary to some of the things I'm doing in the video and some of the decisions I made as far as the design process goes. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button and the ring notification bell so that you'll never miss out on any of our unique content. Thank you. So as you'll see demonstrated in this video, the process of making a segmented bowl is taking your rough stock and cutting wedges that will eventually be glued up into a perfect circle. And once those pieces are in that perfect circle, they need to be sanded smooth so that when you glue up the individual layers, you have a nice tight joint. So in this case, one of the things I had to think about ahead of time was the center of my feature ring, which was canary wood sandwiched in between two pieces of Padauk. So when I milled those three pieces down, I ended up leaving the Padauk a couple of millimeters thicker than the cherry. So once I had these three pieces glued together, and then knowing that those three pieces were eventually going to be a finished ring, I knew that I'd be able to sand off a millimeter or two from the outside of the canary layer, or I'm sorry, from the outside of the Padauk layer, so that those three layers will end up being exactly the same thickness in the final bowl. I think it's often assumed that when a woodworker is working on a project, they might select their lumber just based upon its dimensions to suit their project, but that's often not the case. This particular piece of walnuts was specifically selected because of its location where it came out of the tree. That black dot that I've highlighted here is what's called the pith, and that's the exact center of the tree. So I knew that the lumber directly to the left of the pith that you see in that picture is going to be nice, flat, up and down grain. So how that wood was going to be oriented in my final bowl, I knew I'd have predominantly nice, perfect grain. So nice, perfect straight grain. So eventually, to the end of the video, when you see the final project, kind of keep a note of that. And all the grain lines as it goes around the bottom of the bowl are pretty straight. There's a couple of variations from that, but they're pretty straight, specifically because of the wood that was selected before I made a single cut. Well, at this point, I now have 144 pieces of wood, or 144 segments, that I need to glue up. And the little jig that I've sort of developed over the years just to use a simple piece of melamine shelving where I throw some nails in there, and it lets me stretch out my rubber band. And I have a couple of different size boards for different size rings that I do, and that works out pretty simply for me. There's all kinds of methods out there online. People use tape to lay the segments out on a piece of tape and then tape them in a ring. There's other kinds of jigs people have used. My little rubber band method has always worked perfectly for me. So just sit back and you'll see me gluing 144 segments together. So all my rings have come off the drum sander perfectly flat, and now it's time to glue them all together. You can scour the internet. There's multiple different versions of jigs people have come up with in order to glue their rings up. Sometimes I'll eyeball them and just glue them up in a rack of clamps. In this case, because the bowl design calls for a really thin tolerance at the end, and I don't have a lot of extra wood to work with, I decided just to go ahead and glue them up right on the lathe. It's a pretty straightforward process. Once you get that first ring centered pretty well, I just end up using the tailstock. You'll see me jam that tailstock up against the little scrap board I have there and use the lathe effectively as a clamp. And then I'll glue up each individual ring, let that sit on the lathe for maybe 15 minutes before I move on to the next. And one of the advantages of this is it enables me to spin the project around to verify whether I've actually got that ring centered. And you can see the first attempt there, I didn't have it centered. So I'll just release that clamp, reset that, and I can spin it around again. And once I'm happy that each individual ring is centered, I just let that sit 15 minutes and move on to the next. All right, let's do a little update here. So I've got this set up. I've got 5 layers, 5 rings glued on, and I've let this set up overnight. And then yes, I am wearing the same t-shirt as I had on yesterday. So let's see where we are. Remove this off my headstock. So I've got the first 5 layers of my segmented bowl glued up. This little area here will be filled in with a disc of either the Canarywood or the red heart that will accent my decorative ring near the top. And this piece is what normally would be a sacrificial piece. I went ahead and made it out of walnut because I might leave it on as a little bit of a foot to the bottom of the bowl, but I might just end up turning this whole thing off and make this the bottom of the bowl. I just wanted to see how that looked once everything was glued up. So this might be a sacrificial piece. It might be end up being a part of the bowl. So let's get this remounted and we'll continue gluing on the rest of my ring layers. This particular ring is what is called the feature ring. It's a laminate of outside layers of red heart, inside layer of Canarywood. All right, so I've got the first 5 rings glued up yesterday, and the last 6 rings glued up this morning. And I do have a correction. I think earlier I mentioned that my feature ring was Canarywood and red heart, but I believe it's actually Canarywood and Padauk, which is spelled Padauk and not red heart. So I took my circle cutter without the guidance drill bit in the middle and ended up drilling out, cutting out that's I think a 92 millimeter disc, which will fit there in the middle, and carefully hollowed out that section so it'll fit. Now I'm just going to throw some glue in here and then let this whole thing sit overnight so these outer rings are completely dry and cured before I think about putting turning pressure on them. But yeah, this is not red heart, at least if the label on the wood that I have is correct, but this is Padauk for my accent darker red colors. This piece should be sitting a couple of millimeters proud because it is a little thicker than this piece. So I think we're good to go. We'll let that sit overnight and get back here tomorrow. I promise I'll put a different t-shirt on. Okay, we're almost near the end of the actual bolt turning, and this is a cool shot. This is actually a slow motion recording, so you could kind of see that wood coming off almost in one continuous long string. And you get that when you're turning a segmented bowl because all the grain is typically glued up in the same orientation. And now I finally moved on to the bowl sanding. In this case, because I plan on trying a finish I've never used before, I ended up sanding, starting out with 120 grit, going to 180, 220, 320, 400, and then a final sanding with 600 grit. One thing I'll mention, which I think is super important when you're sanding on the lathe, especially with a power sander like my drill attachment, is that in between each course of sandpaper, you should take some mineral spirits or similar product in a paper towel and just wipe the bowl down and remove all the sawdust and sanding grit. It's typical that after you finish sanding with a 120 grit sandpaper, a couple of those little 120 grit pieces might be left over on the wood, and you go to sand with 180 and you're kind of grinding in that 120 into the wood along with the 180 sandpaper, and that can tend to leave swirl marks. So if you wipe off the bowl down with a mineral spirit type of product, which evaporates pretty quickly in between each of your sanding grits, you'll typically end up with a much superior finish. All right, this is where all the hard work really pays off. I've got maybe 10 hours or so into this salad bowl, and I'm going to try a brand new finish I've never used before. This is a product from Doctor's Wood Shop. It's walnut oil with wax inside the oil, and it's for surfaces that intend to get wet over time. Like I said, it's the first time I've ever used it. I'm not sponsored in any way by Doctor's Wood Shop. This was purchased. So let's give this a go. This is always a nervous time to trying a brand new finish on a bowl. So let's fire this up and see how this looks. We'll do the inside first. I'm going to set the lathe at a pretty low RPM, maybe 200. And let's see how this turns out. So the instructions on this are pretty straightforward. Apply the wax and oil concoction with the lathe spinning, and kind of friction melt the wax that's inside the oil and buff that out to a nice smooth finish. Let's take a look at that so far. That's pretty. That really pops the walnut as well as the Padauk and Canarywood. So let's rotate that camera around over to the other side and give this a whirl on the outside. And this is a food safe finish right off the get-go. I understand from doing research that it'll be pretty good for food usage when it'll get regularly wet, and it can be kind of buffed back out and polished up as needed depending on how often you actually use it. And it's actually safe to use immediately. So I'm really happy how this new finish turned out, and I certainly plan on using it in the future. It's pretty easy to apply and leaves kind of a matte finish with a slight glossiness to it. And we'll see how it wears after actually using this for salad a couple of times as a actually working piece in the kitchen. And at this point, I'll move on to parting the bull off of my sacrificial piece. And I had to be super careful here because if you recall, the very bottom layer of walnut was glued to a pretty big piece of walnut as a sacrificial piece on the bottom. And once I was turning off that sacrificial piece where it was coming in contact with just the Padauk ring in the middle, I had to be concerned that I really didn't have any superior glue adhesion when I inserted that Padauk disc in the middle. So I just wanted to be really careful as I was narrowing down that sacrificial ring to kind of uh, figure out at what point I could just kind of either pull it off by hand or just ended up cutting it off with a saw because I didn't want to, take that parted piece all the way down for fear the bowl might go flying off the lathe. So I'm kind of glad I went at that gingerly because when you saw earlier in the video, when I had glued this Padauk disc in, I wasn't positive how well that piece would have ended up gluing to my sacrificial piece, and it didn't really. There's a kind of a gap in there I could see. So I decided not to part that off completely and just ended up using the saw. And even then, just with a little torque, the glue popped off here. So I think if I had parted that all the way through, the bowl might have gone flying because of bad glue adhesion between the Padauk insert disc and my sacrificial piece. I want to again thank Marc Sitkin for his original work that inspired this piece. And please go to the description down in this video and check out some of Marc's other work. Uh, and I hope you appreciated my tour of what steps I go through to make a segmented bowl. If you have any questions, let me know down in the comments below. Thanks.